Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking on a passage of Scripture that is, well, it's foundational to any discussion of justice.
It really is.
But it's almost certainly one of the most consistently misunderstood phrases in all of ethics.
An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth.
Exactly. It just, it conjures these images of harsh, unforgiving retribution.
It does, and it has been weaponized across history to justify, well, everything. From petty personal feuds all the way up to state-sponsored vendettas.
Right. But as we look at the insights in the essay we're basing this on, the law of retaliation, justice, mercy, and the teachings of Christ, our mission today is to really peel back those layers and get a look at the original intent of that law.
We need to understand lex talionis, that's the formal name, the law of retaliation, as it was given by God through Moses, and then, and this is probably the most crucial part, how Christ redefined its application for his followers today.
And, the moment you start reading the source material, the central, absolutely indispensable correction just jumps off the page.
It really does.
This principle was intended as a fence around justice, not a license for revenge.
Yes.
And that single observation, it completely changes the way you have to approach these famous verses.
Yeah.
It wasn't about authorizing personal vengeance.
Not at all. It was about imposing divine restraint. Proportionality.
Proportionality, that's the word.
That is the core takeaway we have to grasp right from the start. For the Israelites, who were, establishing a brand new nation grounded in divine law, this was a necessary ceiling on punishment.
A ceiling. I like that.
Yeah. If harm occurred, and the law references this repeatedly in Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the judicial penalty absolutely could not exceed the original damage that was suffered.
So the whole goal was not escalation, but limitation. It was the government's way, or maybe better, God's design for the government, to keep punishment calibrated.
Calibrated, yes.
Ensuring it remained contained within the boundaries of the established impartial court system.
And it never spilled out into the streets. That was the whole point. To stop that endless cycle of personal escalating blood feuds.
So when we read this phrase, we have to see it in that context.
Exactly. When you read this phrase, you are reading a law for a judge in a courtroom.
A judge in a courtroom.
Not a moral instruction for a neighbor in a feud. And that one distinction is the anchor for this entire deep dive.
Okay, that makes our mission really clear then. We need to trace this principle from its ancient roots, see how Moses framed it within the covenant, and then, and this is the big turn, understand the radical reinterpretation Jesus gave it in the Sermon on the Mount.
And then finally, look at the very robust, practical apostolic instructions that teach us how believers should live today. How we live under what Paul calls the law of Christ.
So we're seeking to understand how to reconcile, really, judicial justice with the New Testament ethic of loving your enemy.
That's the tension we're exploring.
Okay, let's unpack this historically. Before we even get to Moses and Israel, the essay points out that this principle of proportional payback, symmetrical consequence, was actually a crucial development in the ancient Near East.
It was.
It was essentially a legal strategy to, and I'm quoting here, domesticate violence. What does that mean in the context of, early human society?
Well, you have to imagine a world before codified law. The default mechanism for dealing with any kind of injury was the blood debt system.
The blood debt.
Yeah. So if you injured a member of my tribe, I was justified, by custom, in taking the lives or property of multiple members of yours.
It's not one for one, it's one for many.
Exactly. Retaliation was not about equal payment. It was about demonstrating superior strength. It was a power play, and it often led to the total annihilation of the offending party or their whole family unit.
So society was just constantly on the brink of these chaotic vengeance spirals.
Constantly. There was no brake pedal.
So when a code like Hammurabi's, which we should note predates Moses, when it mandated that an injured eye be answered by the loss of only an eye.
Right, only an eye.
They weren't being cruel, they were actually being revolutionary in their attempt to restore societal stability.
Precisely. They were setting a cap on the payback. That was a primary sociopolitical function. Setting a symmetrical ceiling.
A ceiling.
If a person lost an eye, their family was legally blocked from demanding the aggressor's life or from ransoming their entire estate.
Yeah.
It was, at its heart, a pragmatic legal tool.
Pragmatic how?
Well, it was used to establish predictable limits and preserve the labor pool. You couldn't just wipe out a whole family of farmers over one injury anymore. It capped the violence, and it introduced a concept of a measured response.
But the source material makes a really crucial point here. It says that Israel's law operated in a profoundly different moral universe compared to the pragmatic laws of Babylon or other states in the area.
Yeah.
So if they were both using the same proportional principle, what made Israel's law unique?
The foundation, the why behind the law.
Okay.
For Israel, justice was not merely a pragmatic tool for social order. It was an extension of God's own holiness and character. It was grounded in the inherent dignity of every human being as an image bearer of God.
So it had a theological weight to it that Hammurabi's code just didn't have.
It did, and therefore, Israel's justice had a moral weight that demanded impartiality and the protection of the weak, the vulnerable.
And we see that specifically in passages like Exodus 23, which forbids partiality in judicial rulings. You can't favor the rich or the poor.
Yeah.
And Deuteronomy 16, which demands that judges pursue justice and only justice righteously.
Exactly. It wasn't enough to be proportional, it had to be moral.
So the unique nature of Israel's law meant that lex talionis was situated within this much broader moral framework that required mercy and even-handedness.
That's right. So when we see eye for eye, we must always understand it as a judicial measuring stick for magistrates. It's a tool used by the courts to ensure the integrity and the fairness of the public system.
Let's look closer at the three main contexts where this principle appears in the Mosaic Law, because they absolutely reinforce this point that it's a judicial tool, not a personal permit for revenge.
Good. Let's start with the context in Exodus.
Okay.
In Exodus 21, lex talionis appears squarely within case law. Specifically, it's dealing with damages that are inflicted during accidents or, a fight.
Like the example of the pregnant woman.
Exactly. If men are fighting and they injure a pregnant woman, resulting in further injury or death, the judges have to calibrate the damages precisely to the harm that was suffered. The law lays it out. If a life is lost, you must pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth.
So this isn't God giving a citizen permission to go track down the offender and, take matters into his own hands.
Not at all.
This is God telling the judge how to set the penalty.
Mm.
The judges needed this standard to prevent capriciousness in their rulings.
Yes, and to ensure the penalty was quantifiable and fair based on precedent. It's really an early form of damage assessment and sentencing guidelines.
So the law demands that the judges administer justice that is proportionate. It keeps the focus strictly on compensating for the damage or the suffering that was inflicted.
Exactly. Now, the second context, in Leviticus, broadens this out even further by focusing on impartiality.
Right.
Leviticus 24 places the proportional standard, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, right next to the explicit requirement that the same law applies to the native-born and to the foreigner residing among you.
Which is an incredibly powerful ethical statement for that time.
It's radical. It guarantees even-handedness. The law must apply universally. The court cannot have a bias based on your citizenship or your social status or your heritage.
So lex talionis here serves as a guarantee that the penalty, whether it's a fine or a physical consequence, is standardized and fair for every single person within the covenant community.
Think about the culture of the time. This was, truly radical. Most ancient societies had separate tiers of justice for citizens, foreigners, and slaves. Israel's God-given law insisted on one impartial standard enforced by lex talionis as the calibration tool.
And then we get to Deuteronomy 19, which focuses on protecting the integrity of the judicial process itself. This, to me, is maybe the most powerful illustration of its judicial intent.
I agree. It is. Deuteronomy 19 is all about preventing corruption in the courts. It deals specifically with false witnesses.
Okay.
If a witness schemes to pervert justice, say, by testifying falsely that a man committed a capital offense, intending for that innocent man to lose his life.
A malicious witness.
A malicious witness. The law mandates that the penalty the witness sought to impose unjustly must fall back upon their own head.
The text says it explicitly. Do to the false witness as he intended to do to the other party. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth.
It's a mechanism to deter perjury at the highest level.
And it protects the whole system.
Absolutely. The punishment is tailored not just to the harm done, but to the intent to corrupt the court. The law explicitly states that this penalty has to be carried out so the people would hear and be afraid, and would show no pity to those who sought to ruin the court system.
So this rule was designed to purify the courts and ensure that justice was served truthfully.
Mm-hmm.
It had, It had nothing to do with Mrs. Smith seeking personal revenge against her neighbor for, a broken fence.
Nothing at all. The unified takeaway here is just crystal clear. Lex Talionis was a judicial tool for due process, not a moral license for private citizens to act as judge and executioner outside the framework of the state.
And yet, even with this perfect judicial standard, the source material forces us to acknowledge the reality of the human heart,
Yes.
which constantly strained against that fence of proportionality.
Always.
We see that strain right at the beginning of the biblical narrative, don't we? Human depravity means that even when offensive restraint is established, the instinct is always toward massive, disproportionate vengeance.
It's the story of Lamech in Genesis 4. He's generations removed from the original sin, yet he is boasting about violence.
He's bragging about it.
He's bragging. If Cain, who was a murderer, would be avenged sevenfold, Lamech, whose offense is only hinted at, threatens to be avenged 77-fold.
Doesn't he sevenfold?
This is revenge breaking the banks of justice. It's celebrating escalation rather than restraint. The ratio is just wildly disproportionate.
Or you think of the tragic account of Simeon and Levi in Shechem when they responded to the outrage against their sister Dinah.
Oh, yes.
Their actions, born of hot personal wrath, flooded an entire community with violence and fear, and they ultimately incurred the condemnation of their own father Jacob.
And that's the difference right there. The goal of justice is restoration and proportionality.
Yeah.
The goal of vengeance is satisfaction and domination. The Bible is just so realistic. The human heart constantly confuses the two.
And it's not just in Genesis. Even within Israel's established kingdom, you have Saul's jealous rage toward David. It illustrates this perfectly. A personal grievance, a bruised ego, disguising itself as righteous correction.
All while trampling every standard of equity and fairness. So, Israel absolutely needed the judicial rule to restrain that excess, but the story shows that external restraint was never going to be enough.
They needed something more.
Israel needed a redeemer to change the heart that desires vengeance in the first place.
That transition is so critical. The failure of the human heart to maintain the judicial fence, even one designed by God, brings us directly to the biblical narrative and the need for a change in the law's application for the believer. When Moses first received the law, it was about creating a distinct people whose public life reflected God's holiness and mercy, correct?
Precisely. And holiness and mercy were always intertwined. The mandate in Leviticus 19 is, "Be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy." Proportional justice was required for public order, but it is always hedged with these profound safeguards that reflected God's mercy.
Which included things like the requirement of multiple witnesses to establish charges,
2 or 3 witnesses, yes.
the system of refuge cities for unintentional manslaughter, and the strict forbidding of taking a ransom for a convicted murderer.
Numbers 35 and Deuteronomy 17 detail those protections. And all these systems, they work together to elevate the value of life and ensure the integrity of the court. Lex Talionis was never a lone, isolated command. It lived within this whole neighborhood of carefully balanced safeguards.
But time and human nature, as they do, did their work. By Jesus' era, the statute that was meant for judges had been, as the essay puts it, smuggled into private life.
That's a great way to put it.
People were citing eye for eye as moral justification for settling petty personal scores. They were demanding maximum personal satisfaction for every single slight.
They had taken a judicial measuring stick and turned it into a personal club. And that is why Jesus addresses it so forcefully in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. He acknowledges the familiar teaching. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. He's affirming that it was indeed part of the Mosaic law, but then he issues the pivotal correction. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person.
And we have to pause here because this is the moment of reorientation. If Jesus is telling his followers, do not resist, he is not annulling the government's divine authority to punish crime and maintain order.
That is a critical distinction.
He is specifically forbidding his disciples, his followers, from using a personal grievance as a license for payback.
It is the line between the private sphere and the public sphere. Jesus is addressing the spirit of personal reprisal, that deep-seated human instinct to even the score over slights, insults, and minor losses.
So he's redirecting the fundamental response of his disciples.
He is, from a reflexive, retaliatory reaction to a proactive, redemptive witness.
And he then immediately provides 3 illustrations, which the source material analyzes, that show exactly what this non-retaliation looks like in practice. Let's dive into the cultural context of those, because I think they're often sanitized today.
They are.
First, turning the other cheek.
Okay, so in that culture, violence was very class and status specific. The specific instruction, strike you on the right cheek, would typically be delivered not with a closed fist, but with the back of the hand.
The back of the hand.
Yes. And this was a massive insult. It was a display of contempt designed to humiliate and assert social dominance, often inflicted by a superior on an inferior. It was about public shaming and domination, not necessarily maximum physical harm.
So if someone strikes you with the back of their right hand on your right cheek, you are supposed to turn the left cheek toward them. What does that act accomplish?
It refuses to return that contempt in kind. To strike the left cheek, the aggressor would have to use their open palm, which was reserved for treating equals or for a full-scale physical fight.
So it changes the dynamic.
Completely. By turning the other cheek, the victim denies the aggressor the satisfaction of complete domination through humiliation. It's a courageous, nonviolent act that says, I will not participate in this exchange of malice or accept your definition of my inferiority.
So it's a kind of moral defiance.
It is. It forces the aggressor to reconsider their relationship with you. It's a strategic act, not a passive one.
Okay, that makes it so much more powerful. The second example is equally counterintuitive. Yielding the cloak for the tunic when you're sued.
Right. This relates to the very harsh debt laws of the time. If a creditor was suing a debtor for payment, they might try to seize their possessions.
The outer cloak.
Yes, the outer cloak was not just clothing. It was often the debtor's only blanket or bedding. And the Mosaic Law actually forbade creditors from keeping the cloak overnight. It had to be returned by sundown. It was a legal protection for the poor.
So the creditor in this scenario is trying to exploit a loophole or press the debt to the absolute legal limit.
Exactly. And by offering the tunic as well, the disciple declines the entire game of grasping. They are intentionally being stripped of everything, and in doing so, they bear witness that their identity and their true treasure are not tied up in material goods or personal possessions.
Their treasure is in something far greater, something untouchable by the court.
Exactly. They are shocking the court with generosity. It transforms the shame of being stripped bare into a spiritual protest against materialism and aggression.
In the final illustration, walking a second mile, which has to do with the occupying Roman power.
This is perhaps the most pointedly political example. Roman military law granted a soldier the right to compel any civilian to carry his military equipment, his pack, but only for 1 Roman mile.
And that first mile was a compulsory, humiliating burden.
Enforced by the power of the state, it was a constant reminder of who was in charge.
So when Jesus says walk a second mile, that is where the compliance ends and the voluntary act begins.
The first mile is coercion. The second mile is service. By walking the second mile, the believer turns that coerced servitude into voluntary, proactive service. It totally subverts the relationship.
How so?
Well, the soldier, who is only operating under a very strict legal code, is now placed in this awkward, uncomfortable position of receiving undeserved kindness from someone he just subjugated. It exposes the pettiness of the initial demand, and it demonstrates that the follower of Christ operates by a different internal law.
A law defined by generosity and love, not resentment and grudging compliance.
Exactly. So these are not legalistic instructions for every single situation. They are patterns of conduct. They are wisdom for prioritizing love and trust in God above the instinct to strike back and get even.
They reveal a new way of engaging with the world's malice. And this reorientation, it fits perfectly with the teaching found in the wisdom literature, doesn't it?
It does. Long before Christ, Proverbs 20 cautioned, "Do not say, 'I'll pay you back for this wrong.' Wait for the Lord and he will avenge you." Vengeance is a patient virtue for the believer because it belongs to God.
And the apostles synthesized this beautifully for the early church. Romans 12 seems to be the comprehensive instruction on how to handle vengeance.
Paul ties the thread tight for all believers. He begins with a clear directive. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. And then specifically, do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, "It is mine to avenge, I will repay," says the Lord.
So that's the core shift for the New Covenant community. We relinquish our personal right to vengeance.
We entrust ultimate justice entirely to the Lord.
And what are we instructed to do instead of seeking that satisfaction?
The alternative is practical, radical kindness. The famous instruction is to feed our hungry enemies and quench their thirst, tangible acts of mercy that refuse to mirror the aggressor's malice. We are commanded to proactively overcome evil with good.
And you can't overcome evil merely by resisting it.
No, you overcome it by introducing something fundamentally different and superior into the equation. undeserved kindness and goodness.
But here is the genuine conflict point for the sincere believer. If I am forbidden from taking personal vengeance, why did the early church never forbid Christians from serving in the Roman army?
Right.
I mean, that was the ultimate agent of the state's wrath. Who ensures public safety if everyone is turning the other cheek?
That is an excellent and necessary question. It brings us directly to the complementary role of the state, which Paul addresses in Romans 13, immediately after his instructions on non-retaliation.
Okay, so the very next chapter.
The very next chapter, Paul affirms that the civil government is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. The state legitimately bears the sword in the civil sphere.
So the state holds the sword of justice, but the believer wields the cross of reconciliation. The spheres of authority are separate, but they're both divinely appointed.
Exactly. And Peter affirms this as well in 1 Peter 2, insisting that Christians honor rulers who are sent to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. Non-retaliation is a spiritual ethic for the church. Proportional justice is a civil ethic for the state.
They are distinct stewardships from God.
They are.
And the ultimate model for all of this, the essay reminds us, is Christ himself, the template of the cross.
Yes, it reminds us of 1 Peter 2 that when Jesus was insulted and suffered, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats.
Instead of striking back.
He entrusted himself to him who judges justly.
And that reframes the entire concept of non-retaliation. It wasn't passivity or cowardice.
No, it was the ultimate courageous act of submitting to the Father's authority to judge and justify. It was proactive submission to divine justice.
He bore our sins in the tree so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness.
And his actions become the template for every follower. We imitate Christ by relinquishing our personal grievances and trusting them to the just judge, rather than demanding immediate personal satisfaction. This surrender of vengeance is the first step toward true forgiveness.
That distinction between spheres personal and church ethics versus state administration, that brings us to the theological core of the essay, which uses a dispensational framework to clarify these distinct expectations. Help us define why that framework is so useful for interpretation here.
Well, this framework is simply a helpful way of structuring God's work throughout history. Sometimes they're called stewardships or economies. In this context, it just helps us categorize to whom God gave specific commands and for what purpose.
So you don't misapply a command.
Exactly. Without this clarity, we end up hopelessly confusing a law given to a nation for civil order with an ethic given to the church for spiritual witness.
Okay, so under the dispensation of law, God was establishing the nation of Israel as a covenant community.
That's right. Israel was a national political entity. Therefore, lex talionis was the public norm, administered by judges and elders. It was the necessary standard for maintaining a just, ordered, and holy national civil life. That was one stewardship.
But with Christ's death and resurrection, we enter the stewardship of the church age.
Precisely. And the church is not a nation, it's a spiritual body of believers from every nation. Our defining law is the law of Christ.
Which Galatians 6 identifies as bearing one another's burdens.
Right, and which Christ himself defined as the new command to love one another as he loved us. This is a personal and corporate ethic marked by non-retaliation and enemy love. This is the new sphere of the believer.
And the sphere of the state remains distinct, as we established earlier with Romans 13.
The magistrate retains the legitimate authority to punish evil as God's minister in the civil realm, operating under a different divine mandate than the church.
And this clarity of distinct stewardships is so vital because, as the essay points out, it helps us avoid two common and destructive errors that confuse believers today.
It does.
The first error is the one we started with, using Old Testament courtroom language to justify personal payback.
This is the error of private vengeance. People cite eye for eye to justify their personal grudges or, demand punitive damages for minor slights. Jesus decisively closes that door in Matthew 5.
You cannot use the judicial standard for a nation to justify your personal rancor or retaliation against your colleague or your neighbor or your spouse.
It is a total abuse of the text.
And the second error is the error of collapsing justice.
Yes. This error arises when people take the high personal ethic of Christian non-retaliation and they try to apply it universally to the state. They argue that if believers are called to turn the other cheek, then the state must abandon its calling to restrain evil.
Which Paul explicitly counters.
He does by affirming the magistrate's sword in Romans 13.
Because if the state refused to restrain evil, the vulnerable, the widows, the orphans, the weak, They would be immediately and devastatingly harmed by the wicked.
That's right. So non-retaliation for the saint does not mean indifference to the necessity of public justice and order.
So the balance is this. As believers, we neither take vengeance personally, nor do we despise the need for public justice administered by the proper authority.
We renounce personal retaliation while honoring due process.
So how does that look in practice? If a believer is wronged, say, financially defrauded or physically harmed, how do they navigate seeking justice without seeking vengeance?
Well, we look to the Apostle Paul as a model. He never, ever sought personal revenge against those who persecuted him for his faith.
Never.
But when his life, his freedom, or his ministry was threatened unjustly, he absolutely appealed to lawful authority.
He used his rights as a Roman citizen repeatedly.
Yes. In Acts 22, when Roman officers were about to have him flogged without a trial, Paul didn't turn the other cheek to the illegal scourging. He asserted his rights as a Roman citizen to secure due process.
He knew the scourging would unjustly damage his health and reputation.
Of course. And later, in Acts 25, when he's facing a rigged local trial in Judea, he appealed directly to Caesar to secure a fair hearing in Rome.
And that action, an appeal to Caesar, is fundamentally different from personal spite or vigilantism.
Worlds apart.
He wasn't taking revenge. He was utilizing the existing God-ordained legal structures to achieve justice and protect his ability to proclaim the gospel.
It's an appeal to a higher, impartial authority. It recognizes that God established the state for the very purpose of restraining evil and administering justice. Paul modeled how to uphold the ethical non-retaliation of the cross in our personal lives, while simultaneously honoring the judicial mandate of the magistrate in the civil sphere.
And this leads to the ultimate assurance, the thing that frees us from the burden of carrying a personal ledger of grievances.
Yes.
The eschatological horizon, the certainty of Christ's return.
That certainty is the single greatest liberation for the disciple who has been wronged. The church lives between Christ's first coming, where he bore judgment for our sins, and his second coming, where he will return as the ultimate judge of the world.
We are assured that nothing escapes the Lord's eye.
Nothing. And this means we can endure wrongs without hatred, because we know that every account will be set straight. It frees us from having to be the ultimate judge in our own situation.
It's a huge weight off our shoulders.
It is. 2 Thessalonians 1 promises that God will pay back trouble to those who trouble us. And this is not a license for us to anticipate their suffering with glee.
Right.
It's an assurance that justice will be done perfectly and impartially. We are called to peace and forbearance because God is not slack. He is just.
And the future judgment is not a weak or capricious one. The prophet Isaiah gives us that powerful image of the Messiah's rule in the millennial kingdom.
Yes, Isaiah 11 gives us the picture of the Messiah judging with righteousness and slaying the wicked with the breath of his lips. This is not an abstract judgment. It is perfect, authoritative justice that is neither compromised by mercy nor polluted by weakness.
So our present-day ethic of mercy actually anticipates that future world where all things will be made right.
It does. It allows us to give up the heavy, soul-corroding weight of needing to control the outcome of justice right now.
Okay, we've established the theological scaffolding. Now let's bring it down to the ground. The essay rightly points out that for most believers, the real testing ground isn't an appeal to Caesar or some high-stakes court case.
Not at all.
It's the daily frictions of ordinary life.
That's where the rubber meets the road. We're talking about the microaggressions. The colleague who undermined you in a meeting, the online insult that felt personally targeted, the neighbor who repeatedly violates the property line.
The family dispute that flares up over minor perceived slights.
All of it. The Jesus teachings on the cheek, the cloak, and the mile are profound wisdom for breaking the retaliatory escalation cycle that's inherent in these frictions.
And we must always remember that these instructions are not legal codes. They are patterns of conduct aimed at prioritizing love of enemy over the reflexive instinct to strike back.
It's about spiritual strategy. It's about witness. When you refuse to return contempt, when you refuse to grasp for possessions, or when you turn coercion into voluntary service, you are bearing witness to the fact that you follow a Lord who operates on generosity, not vengeance.
You're introducing a foreign element of gate love into a world that only understands quid pro quo. This for that.
That's it exactly.
But we have to be extremely clear on the difference between forgiveness and enabling harm. This is a tension that always creates difficulty for Christians.
It is critical. The New Testament refuses to confuse forgiveness with passivity. Forgiveness is a posture of the heart that releases the debt owed to us personally. It means we renounce the right to seek revenge or hold the grudge.
However, releasing the personal debt does not remove the need for public accountability, especially when others are vulnerable.
Absolutely not. Paul affirms the state's role to punish wrongdoing in Romans 13. If a Christian is defrauded, for instance, they can forgive the fraudster from the heart-renounce hatred and revenge while still seeking restitution or reporting the crime to the police, who are God's agents for justice.
The motivation is the difference.
The motivation is everything. Seeking protection or restitution out of love for the vulnerable, not vengeance driven by hatred for the aggressor.
What about internal church discipline, which can feel like a form of judgment?
Even within the church, non-retaliation doesn't imply moral laxity. When unrepentant sins, say, abuse or chronic deceit endangers others, it must be confronted, following the pattern in Matthew 18.
Discipline is necessary for the sake of truth and the protection of the flock.
It is. And the ultimate aim is always restoration, but love of neighbor requires both mercy and justice, as Micah 6 reminds us. We must do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God.
So we move from the theological foundation to the actionable steps laid out in what the essay calls the apostolic path, derived from Romans 12. Let's detail these 4 steps for our listener.
Okay, the first step is the spiritual foundation. Entrust ultimate justice to God. This is a moment of spiritual freedom. We are released from carrying the spiritual burden of vengeance, which, if carried by a human heart, inevitably corrodes the soul.
God has explicitly pledged, I will repay. We don't have to carry that weight. We don't have to occupy that job description.
It's not our job. That is the surrender of control. The second step is a commitment to action, not just passivity. Pursue peace. Paul is profoundly realistic here. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. The believer must always be the aggressor for peace. We are responsible for initiating reconciliation and avoiding conflict whenever possible.
But he adds that qualifier, if it is possible.
He does, because he acknowledges that peace sometimes stalls because the other person refuses it. We are responsible for our side of the street, but we are not responsible for forcing the other person's will. We pursue peace without surrendering truth.
Let's apply that to a modern friction, receiving online slander or a vicious attack on social media. How do those first 2 steps apply there?
Well, first, you entrust ultimate justice to God. You don't get drawn into the comment section to engage in a toxic, escalating fight because the desire to win that fight is often just veiled vengeance.
You release the need for public vindication to God.
Exactly. Second, you pursue peace. This might mean refusing to engage publicly, choosing silence, or perhaps reaching out privately if the person is known to you, seeking to de-escalate rather than matching their public rancor.
Silence can sometimes feel like defeat. But in this context, it's a refusal to be drawn into the aggressor's system of retaliation.
It's a powerful refusal. And the third step then pushes us even further into radical action. Do tangible good to enemies.
This is the most countercultural act of all.
It is where we refuse to let evil dictate our conduct. Instead of mirroring malice, we introduce goodness. This active kindness, the feeding of the hungry or giving drink to the thirsty enemy, is not just passive niceness. It is an aggressive, spirit-led move to overcome evil with good.
The phrase sometimes associated with this, heaping burning coals on his head, it's often misunderstood.
It is. It's not a wish for pain. It's an ancient metaphor, possibly suggesting an act so kind it shames the foe into reconsidering their actions and repenting.
Let's apply this radical step to a workplace scenario. Say a colleague actively tried to sabotage your project, leading to a professional loss for you.
The natural human response is to expose them, smear them quietly, or deny them help when they later need it. The apostolic path demands the opposite. We entrust the professional offense to God. We pursue peace by not escalating the conflict. And when they inevitably need help, say, they miss a crucial deadline and need expertise only you possess, you do tangible good, you help them.
Not to manipulate them?
No, not to manipulate them, but as a demonstration that your allegiance is to Christ's ethic, not to a system of professional vengeance. This is how you overcome that evil with good.
And finally, the 4th step acknowledges the reality that sometimes wrongs rise past the level of personal friction, and they require public order.
Yes. Make lawful appeals without rancor.
So if the wrong is a serious crime, or fraud, or civil injury that causes real harm, the believer uses the lawful systems God has established.
We seek righteous adjudication, whether it's seeking restitution for stolen funds or reporting abuse to the authorities. But critically, we must do it without rancor. Our heart posture, even while seeking justice, remains marked by non-retaliation.
And 1 Timothy 2 gives us the spiritual framework for this. We are instructed to pray for all those in authority.
Yes, we pray for those who prosecute, those who judge, and even the people who wronged us. We are not praying for destruction. We are praying for the restoration of order and for justice tempered by righteousness. This entire system, these 4 steps, it requires a supernatural transformation. This is not natural human behavior.
It requires the Spirit shaping Christ's mind in us, replacing that instinct to self-preservation and wounded pride with the fruit of the Spirit: love, peace, patience, kindness. That fruit is essential for this ethic to be lived out.
And when a community of believers genuinely adopts this path, it creates a truly distinct countercultural ethic. The essay highlights examples across families, congregations, and business.
In families where slights and insults happen daily, this ethic means parents teach children that insults are not answered with insults,
Right.
that apologies are offered freely, and that reconciliation is always prized more highly than getting the last word. It breaks those generational cycles of bitterness and grudge holding.
And in congregations, which are meant to be models of this new ethic, the leadership must model non-retaliation above all. Elders must model the refusal to trade barbs or nurture grudges. They choose to keep no record of wrongs, in the sense of weaponizing past failures.
While still taking sin seriously enough to pursue repentance and repair in a restorative way.
Yes, the culture must be marked by hope for restoration, not lingering resentment or gossip.
And finally, even in the competitive world of business, this ethic changes how believers handle being wronged.
If a business owner suffers a breach of contract or fraud, they may pursue restitution through proper legal channels, using the courts as agents of order. But they refuse to smear opponents or shade the truth or seek malicious destruction of the other party's business or reputation.
The community's posture in all these scenes, family, church, business, it declares that Jesus is Lord over our anger, our vengeance, and our personal honor.
The logic of payback has been fundamentally broken by the cross.
The ultimate application, then, is that we respond to evil with good, because we have been recipients of mercy at immeasurable cost. We are simply passing on the economy of grace we received. Tag outro.
So let's synthesize the core message one last time. Lex talionis was a vital, necessary law for ancient Israel. It established a moral ceiling on punishment, ensuring justice was proportional and public.
And it prevented the chaos of endless blood feuds.
It did, but Christ exposed its corruption and misuse in the private sphere. The cross opened a fountain of grace, summoning us to a deeper, counterintuitive righteousness that refuses to mimic evil.
So believers today live as citizens who support rightful state authority, and as saints who renounce personal revenge, answering enmity with love.
And the assurance that God's perfect, certain judgment awaits all wrongdoing frees us from the impossible burden of needing to carry the ledger of our own hurts now. We are free to overcome.
The essay closes by focusing our minds directly on that powerful, comprehensive instruction found in Romans 12, which provides both a strong warning and profound encouragement for how we are to live out this ethic every single day.
The warning is sharp and clear. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, "It is mine to avenge, I will repay," says the Lord. We must relinquish that authority to God.
But the encouragement is transformative and active. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.
May you find the courage, guided by the Spirit and modeled by the sacrifice of Christ, to leave all judgment in the Lord's capable hands, and instead devote your energy to living a life marked by intentional peace and tangible kindness toward all who cross your path. Go and overcome evil with good.